Oh, not today, another time. But can everyone see my screen okay? And everyone can hear me okay? Yes, no? Can someone give me a thumbs? Okay, perfect. Good. Then let's get started. So, really, it's an absolute pleasure to kick off 2026 with the BioVis meetups this year. And today I'll be talking about crafting visual biomedical stories. And I like to start these talks with a little bit of a warm up. So, what I'm going to ask you guys to do a little bit of work first. And so, what I'd like you to do is to just think for a moment about your favorite story. And if anyone is feeling brave, then feel free to shout out a story that you love now or as a child. No one. So I'll briefly share one of mine then instead. So one of my favorite stories is The Hobbit from J.R.R. Tolkien. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this story, Bilbo Baggins is the titular character, and we follow him from his home in Hobbiton that we see here on the right, and on his subsequent journey around other parts of Middle Earth. And this is happening in a time that feels a lot like our Middle Ages. For the Tolkien nerds out there, this is in the final years of the Third Age. And this is really an adventure story where Bilbo goes on this grand adventure with a wizard and a bunch of dwarves. And what they're trying to do is to reclaim treasure and the dwarves' kingdom. That's sort of what's happening on the surface. But on a deeper level, what we're really seeing is a story about Bilbo's personal growth and development. And we see Bilbo's transformation through these different challenges, through these different uh, steps and things that he endures. He goes through various encounters, and he ultimately comes back to Hobbiton at the end of the story as a changed person. And this path is following a story structure archetype that some of you might have heard of called the hero's journey. And I'll revisit this later on in the talk in the context of a medical data story. So at this point, you might be scratching your head about why I'm talking about The Hobbit in a BioVis meetup, but really it's because stories and these various elements that I've just been talking about, the who, the what, the why, the how, these are really inspirational, I think, when it comes to communicating about our data. So data-driven storytelling is really a catchphrase now. It's described as a technique to help to motivate and to engage an audience. And telling stories about data applies traditional storytelling elements, as I've sort of walked through, like I said, with The Hobbit, to help an audience better relate to and engage with data, with information. And combining data with stories through the medium of visualization affords us many opportunities to bring our data more to life. So let's just have a quick look at one way that we can think about telling a visual data story. So most of you here are probably familiar with this flatten the curve visual. This was released early in the COVID-19 pandemic to reduce burdens on healthcare services. There is a clear and urgent story here, and it's realized with color semantics, with the two curves, with annotations, particularly with this dotted line that we see, and text annotations as well. But you can also take the same information and turn it into something that's following more of a narrative, and it gives it a different feel. So here we see the same information, but it's been sort of reframed in the form of a comic. So this same data, the same core message, but here we see an introduction of human characters with their own thoughts and feelings. And that can help to bring more context and to make the message here a little bit more emotionally engaging. And one of the big reasons for this focus on stories in particularly in visual communication, as opposed to other visual strategies that are focused on more experts that are looking at analysis or exploratory questions that are really for people who are deeper into the data. When we're communicating our science, there's different sort of modes of communicating. And one of the kind of old school modes of communication that has been around for a while and what we're finding more and more often just does not work is the deficit model of scientific communication. So, as it turns out, if you dump a ton of facts onto someone to try to fill this so called knowledge gap, they're unfortunately not just going to see the light and automatically change their mind and do what you want them to do, even if it is for their own best interests. So, what we have seen that shows potential for the behavior and emotional changes and reactions that we, from sort of an altruistic perspective, when we're making these data stories in biology and medicine, is through telling stories. And I've been thinking about storytelling in different contexts for a while now. So, just to briefly say a little bit about me before I go too much further into this talk. So, I started out studying biology and medicine, but I realized I also really enjoy art and design and that creative aspect of sort of working with drafting. And I worked for several years as a biomedical illustrator based in the US. There, I was working mostly in health and technology startups that were geared towards clinical training and patient education. And at some point, I was ready for a change and I moved to Norway for my PhD in visualization within a computer science department here at Bergen, where I've now been an associate professor for almost 3 years in the same research group. So, in a nutshell, the research that I do within my lab with my PhD students and my master's students is I'm interested in looking at how people think about working with data and making visualizations through this process of data transformation and mapping and these sort of rhetorical layers that happen in that process. But ultimately, how these visuals that we make are read and then acted upon by our target audiences. And I'm especially interested in this in the context of biological and medical data, although, as Helena pointed out, I have other sort of topics that I'm interested in exploring as well. So, enough about me. What I'd like to do for the rest of this talk is to run through a very practice-oriented framework to guide that I'm interested in thinking about more and guiding creating a story from my data or your own data that captures the essential elements of a story. So as I go through this framework, I'm not trying to be very comprehensive, but I will include some examples from my work and others that I've found inspirational that are focused mostly on telling biomedical stories that will, I hope, help bring this from theory a little bit more into practice and give you something useful after this talk. So the framework is the 5 Ws, or really it's the 5 Ws and 1 H framework. And this is something that I'm borrowing from journalism. So this is actually a checklist that dates back all the way to 1913 that journalists still often use today to check that their lead, which is in this case their opening paragraph, contains all of the essential points to draw a reader into their story. And so I've been thinking about how this can work as a checklist for storytelling in my own projects. And it feels like this makes for some helpful guideposts in building out the shape of a story. And so what I'll do is just step through these elements of this framework one at a time, beginning with the who. With the who, what we want to do is identify the people, the groups, or the entities involved. And for us, that essentially asks us to point out the central quote unquote characters in our data. And there's various visual strategies that I think we can use to help support identifying these individual characters or entities. With the medical data that I'm often working with, this usually involves different attributes from an individual or a collection of individuals. And in a communication-oriented context, I often want to bring some humanity and empathy into that data. And anthropographics are one way to do this. So there's different degrees of abstraction that you can consider that you see arrayed out here in this figure. So going from basic symbols that you can use to represent different attributes of different individuals. So here, this is showing race, up through as we kind of go around the circle to more illustrative personal feeling representations. So this kind of graphical representation doesn't necessarily need to map people to people. You can choose to map non-human entities to graphic or illustrative elements to help make them more relatable. It's essentially personification. And this can also be something when we're thinking about symbolism. So an example of this would be something like the concept of AI that I think everyone's sort of familiar with, the symbol where you have the human head with the gears inside. So this is kind of anthropomorphizing non-human element to try to help people understand and connect to this thing. So in our own work, we've experimented with representing patient characters on this realism continuum that I've just shown in the previous slide. So we've played with using basic circles to using more kind of clearly demarcated individuals that are still quite graphic. Like we see in the middle, we have this kind of humanoid shape that has the heart. That's a very sort of graphic heart, not an anatomical heart, going all the way up to photorealistic patients on the far right. And so this is one that a master student from the Magdeburg was working with colleagues there. And what she ended up doing with this was used a generative AI, I think it was Leonardo in this case, to develop a patient character from the particular set of attributes that had values that indicated a certain degree or certain stage of liver cancer. So this was a really interesting way to explore this, how generative AI worked. This was now 2 years ago, which I think in that technology is like light years away. So I'd be curious to see how this works now. But that was kind of the idea that we had when we were working with this. But with these cases, the reason that we're working with these kind of anthropographics is to create characters from our data in a way to personalize and provide a relatable hook to bring the audience into our work. So moving on then to the what. So this is where we identify the event, the action, or the main issue that we want to highlight within our data story. In kind of visualization parlance, this can also be the main insight that you want to convey. And on a fairly basic level, a general strategy that admittedly can also be helpful in identifying your who. So some of these strategies that I'm going to be talking about throughout this talk can be applied as well to other elements in this framework. But here I'm thinking about this, in this case, the grouping cues in the context of the what, to help to draw the eye and to guide attention to your key event or your key insight that you're wanting to focus on. So these are some fairly basic statistical chart examples. And here we're seeing the use of color or annotations through additional shapes and text to show how certain elements sit together or apart from one another. So in this top bar graph, there's these this use of this red color to show how poor Evan here has gotten worse in performance in some exam. And I've used color in some of my projects to show relatedness and sequence. So for example, this image here that I have on the left of a molecular reaction is using what's called an analogous color palette to show that these molecules are related in function and the hues are moving stepwise around the color wheel to show the sequence of the events in the reaction. So it can be really fun to experiment with color harmony rules, some of which I've shown here on the right. So there's monochromatic, complementary, analogous, like I mentioned, others as well. That can help provide semantic groupings to indicate certain functional groups or draw attention to a moment when your sort of key insight is visible. And here I've used saturation as a separate grouping cue to make my topmost molecule here stand out as the one that's currently in a bound and active state before everything sort of continues. So I talked about anthropographics earlier, which are actually a special kind of conceptual metaphor, but we can use these kinds of metaphors more broadly to help communicate an unfamiliar event or phenomenon to an audience. So for instance, this is a story chapter from a project, again, with a different set of colleagues in Magdeburg, that's using the metaphor of a tornado to introduce the concept of vortices that produce the aneurysms, these kind of bubbles that form in your blood vessels. And the formation and the treatment of these vortices is the focus of this data story. So we wanted to have a whole sort of segment of the story that was focusing on establishing what these are and try to scaffold meaning for how these actually relate to something that someone might be more familiar with. So if you're from the Midwest in the US, you've probably, if not seen a tornado, you've probably been under a tornado watch or a tornado warning. So this is something that we're familiar with in Norway, especially. This is not something that would, I think, resonate as well, but just because of media and movies and stuff like this, people know what this is. So next in our checklist is where. So here we're focusing on where is this actually happening? So where are the issues or the desired insights located? And here I like to think about kind of at the beginning of all of this, what extent it is that location is actually important to visually represent in terms of the overarching issue. It can also be that your data doesn't have that location information there. So then you have to think about other ways to manage this. But here, sort of with the examples I'm introducing here, I'm assuming that the location is something important to demonstrate. And something that I think is really interesting with a lot of biological phenomena is that you have these things happening over fairly broad scales of space and time as well, but we'll talk about just space for now. So there's different levels of detail that you often need to think about and need to somehow display in a way that isn't going to totally overwhelm the person that you're trying to share this information with. So if the location is in fact available and important to show, I like to go back to this notion of abstraction and think about how much detail actually I need to show at any given point in the story that I'm trying to tell. So I can think about things like, is the spatial location more about giving just context to help localize where something is going on? Or do I need, for example, atomic level detail to communicate very specifically and precisely where something is happening or where my characters are situated? So there are more advanced visual solutions that allow for dynamic detail adjustment. So this is a figure from work from colleagues in Vienna that's looking at different spatial scales, different levels of detail for building out here DNA nanotechnology structures. And with this kind of adjustment, it's not just about coming up with the abstractions that exist at each scale. So here we have scale 2 atoms up to scale 9, where it's kind of the larger geometry. But there's also this thought that needs to go into thinking about the transition between these scales. So how do I actually go from scale 2 to 3 to 4, where I have the nucleotides? And this is, I think, the really fun part of visualization and the kind of work that we're doing in the computer science discipline of visualization, is thinking about how to build out these transitions in a way that helps to sort of scaffold reasoning from moving between these scales. In a more sort of straightforward static example that's drawing from my life as an illustrator, something that is a fairly typical technique is to use like side panels and insets that provide additional details about structure and location that are to some extent slightly auxiliary to the main story thread, but still important. So here I've made, in this example here, so this is showing the way that sugar is ingested and then processed in your body. So this is part of a larger series that I did for the university here in the medical faculty about diabetes. But here I want to show the detailed structure of the glucose chains that are inside this ice cream cone, or the little glucose trains that have now been sort of broken up that are at the end of the stomach in this next inset. So this is detail stuff, but it's not something that you absolutely completely need to follow sort of the more high level part of the story. So there's ways to think about designing the level of detail to help provide this information in a sort of layered way, even if you have just a static representation. So we talked about location. We also need to talk about time. Biological and medical events usually have some sort of time course that we often want to indicate. this is, again, what I think makes this topic area so fun to work with is you have these scales of time, you have these scales of space, and you often need to find a way to reconcile them somehow in a way that doesn't make someone's head explode at the same time. So when we think about time specifically, we want to think about showing questions like how fast does something happen? How long does the overall process take? Or just even more generally, how do we show that there is some notion of time passing? And if I go back to this diabetes illustration series that I mentioned, one of the more straightforward ways to show time passing, especially when you're restricted to a static medium, is to show time actually through space in terms of the spatial layout, I mean. So here I'm trying to show for a lay audience the way that sugar is processed in the human body in normal circumstances. That starts with ingestion and ends as we kind of snake through this with glucose being processed into usable energy. And so if I just make this a little bit bigger, then you can see the two kind of halves of the overall poster. And so here I'm using this grouping strategy that I mentioned a little bit earlier, but I'm using this grouping to create this sort of swinging cutout shape that you see that helps show the flow of the events. So this is showing that I'm trying to show here some sort of time course through these kind of spatial positionings. At the more basic level, I could also just show this with arrows moving between these different graphic elements. And the thing here that I'm also doing is I'm aware in this case that my audience is sort of a Western readership. And so I'm also relying on the sort of semantics of layout. So top down, left right orientation to guide the reader's eye. So this is something useful to think about if you were going for something that was more for an audience that's based in another part of the world that has a more of a right to left reading, then you would want to think about sort of flipping the orientation of this to help show time in a way that makes sense for that audience without them having to work so hard. A more sophisticated solution that gives a lot of control over experiencing time is this work that's now quite a few years ago from colleagues based in Vienna that's called illustrative time lapse. And so what this is doing is it's using an agent-based simulation to help manipulate the timing of a molecular reaction at different scales. So in this image that we see here, we've got two frames. The main two molecules that are larger and in focus here are experiencing their reaction at a much slower rate than everything that's kind of going around in the background. This speed is controlled by the user, and they can explore around the scene to slow down or accelerate the other agents in the scene to help them get a sense of what's going on sort of at their own pace. So we've covered most of the basics, the who, what, the where, the when, but there's also the why and the how. And for me, in terms of the visual design strategies that I'll be talking about, these are very closely related to each other, but I've chosen to split them up in this way, in a way that I hope makes sense. So in a story, we often want to know why something is happening. So what is the reason or the motivation behind the event? So this is essentially adding more information. And then here we want to think about presenting that information in a way that, again, isn't bombarding the user or the audience or the reader, however you want to call the person who's engaging with the visualization, the story that you're making. And here I want to think about really empowering the user to make their own investigation into the data and see not just kind of the final outcome, but all these other things that feed into helping to explain why something has been happening. So this I like to do by breaking a story out into key moments that can be provided then through sequential layered insights. Providing this in a sequence is helpful because it helps to give the story sort of a narrative, so the audience can see um, this is where the how kind of starts to feed into here, but how something proceeds from one step to another, but it can also show the sort of conditions around what shape the event to actually happen. So here the example I'm showing is using a technique called scrolly telling. So this is employed in this data story about Georgia Loopy's journey with long COVID. And we're seeing this interactive and sequential way of showing all of the different elements and reasons that led to her journey with this disease and how she coped with it throughout that whole time. So all the different pieces that fed into giving her the eventual diagnosis and how this ended up affecting her in the various aspects of her life. And the scrolly telling strategy is using what's called a martini glass strategy. So this is coming from work that was published by Siegel in here from, I think it was 2010 now. And this is something that's a really landmark way of thinking about data-driven storytelling. And so with this martini glass structure, essentially what you're doing is you're giving someone a starting point that's shared for everyone, and then everyone sort of moves through the same kind of story. And at the end of the story, interactions can broaden out to experience the story kind of in the way they want. So they have a little bit more agency. This is another example of a scrolly telling experience that one of my PhD students built out. In this case, she was working with genetic data and trying to show how variations in certain genes lead to different growth with young children. It's following the same sort of idea here. We can think about giving a reader even more agency by changing the type of interaction that we're building in. So interactive slideshow is another strategy that we see a lot. This was the main strategy that we used when I was working at this company, BioDigital, based in New York City. So here the user has a little bit more agency to explore and investigate the different features that are included within each of these slides. So here they can look around at this 3D anatomical model and maybe get a deeper sense of why something is the way it is before they advance to the next chapter. And you can also see this in something that's maybe more classically considered a visual analytics solution. So this is a Explorer interface that another one of my PhDs, Hannah Balika, built out, that's using kind of this interactive slideshow idea through this set of guidance strategies where someone who's unfamiliar with this interface is able to move through the different parts of the interface and learn about the details of the science that undergirds the visualizations and the data that we're seeing. It's using the same sort of idea, though, as this interactive slideshow. And the last kind of interaction class that I wanted to bring in here is what's called a drill down structure. So this is a strategy that gives the user the most agency in exploring a data story. They can kind of start to craft their own narrative in a way. And you can combine this with other strategies as well. So here I have a big black mark because I think I forgot to change the color. But this drill down thing is combining, in a way, this interactive slideshow where you have still this sequence of events, but you can dig deeper into these levels to learn more, for example, about the data type, or to learn more about, in this case, the condition that this patient had. A fully open world with this drill down structure would be something like the Better Life Index, if anyone's had a chance to play with this before. So this isn't strictly biomedical data, but this is still, I think, a really nice example that's showing how someone can have full agency in exploring, in this case, different countries, and why their overall index is what it is, and investigate those underlying reasons. So we're coming to the end. This is the last point that I want to talk about within this framework, and this is the how. So this is then, again, fairly closely related to the why, but this is looking now at the process and the manner in which the event occurs. So here, sequence is really the big focus, and the way that that sequence is built through a particular form of narrative. And I'll just talk about a couple of strategies here that I've worked with in my research with colleagues. Both of these examples are again from our long-term collaborators in Magdeburg. So the first is using the strategy called the Freytag's pyramid. This might be also more familiar as the 5-act structure. So if you know any of Shakespeare's plays, they're all sort of following this basic thing. And this is what you see as the kind of way that a lot of movies are set up. So you have an exposition, a rising action, a climax where the drama sort of peaks, and then everything sort of starts to calm back down until you reach a denouement. And in the case of a medical story, we mapped this 5 acts to what you see up here, where you have the definition of a disease, you have the base anatomy that then have symptoms that act on certain anatomical structures that result in the diagnosis of a disease, which is sort of the peak drama of a story when you're walking through something like this. And then eventually you have treatment options with a prognosis and hopefully prevention. And that's the way the story starts to resolve. And hopefully, of course, we have something positive that we can talk about, but that's not always the case. In the case of this story, so I've shown this now quite a few times. So this is with this patient who has a bicuspid aortic valve that results in aneurysms within the aorta. And we used this strategy to try to walk through the experience that this patient goes through, but also to give information about the data, about the disease, about how this is managed, and ultimately how this is treated, with then providing more information on the provenance of the sort of story elements and the data itself, which is another, I think, important part of data-driven storytelling that I'm not focusing on so much in this talk. But how do you convey information and tell a story that show that you're a not just an authority, but a trusted authority that means well. And that's something that I think is not unique to the topics that we have in biomedical visualization, but is something that's just part of communication and is a very kind of open area of research that I think is really exciting to be looking into. So that's Freytag's pyramid. And then the second one that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk with Bilbo Baggins and his hero's journey is looking at this now in a medical context. And so here, what we're doing is looking at following an entity here, often a person, although it doesn't necessarily need to be, on some sort of journey. So in this project, the PhD student, Sarah, looked at the hero's journey from both a patient perspective as well as from a clinician's perspective. And we looked at how this hero's journey circle is adapted for the clinician and then for the patient, and sort of told the same story about this disease from those different perspectives, and then looked at how that sort of impacted the way that people received that story. So that's the sort of high level view of this journalistic framework: the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, and the how. And it's something that I think can be a really useful guiding framework for helping to establish key story elements. But there's of course some caveats and considerations that I want to leave you to chew on. And perhaps if there's time after, we can discuss this a little bit. I think that one thing to really keep in mind here is that storytelling by nature is a subjective experience. The way that you or someone else receives a story and the messages that you draw from it, the learnings that you draw from it, depend on a lot more than what actually is put into the story. And this can even come down to the kind of day that you had before listening to the story, and that can shape what you take away, because so much of storytelling is about drawing on emotions and connections. And if you've had a really bad day, then you might pick up on the more negative parts of the data story. And then, as well intended as the story designer might have been for you to receive a particular insight, you're not going to get it. So I think that's an important thing to bear in mind, is that stories are situated and they're also very contextual. So for me, the Hobbit evokes a very particular set of feelings and memories and associations that are unlikely to be the same for anyone here. Even if you know The Hobbit and you love The Hobbit, you probably have a kind of a different set of feelings about that story. And so I think it's important to be aware of this. And it just means as well that having a really clear sense of who your intended audience is. I don't think it's really possible for us to design visual data stories for this kind of monolithic lay audience or general audience that a lot of us often talk about. I think really it's good if we're able to really target who we want to focus on, and to as specific as we can be. So we're focusing on the right metaphors and the right story patterns and these sorts of things. And when we think about sort of the visualization pipeline where you have data processing and analysis that come into the mappings that we use to go from the data to a visual space, these choices are also to various degrees subjective and contextual. And I think stories can be also a really meaningful way to show those decisions and reveal more of our process and not just the finished result. So with that, hopeful food for thought, I'll wrap that up here, and I'm happy to chat more if anyone has any questions or comments.